Pádraig, lovely to see you,
Thank you, Charlie.
and delighted to have a chance to talk to you about what I know is one of your core passions. I think that'd be probably fair to say, but you can demonstrate that as we talk. So, I guess my first question is quite a simple one. Would be for you. What's the connection between poetry and conflict?
Language is the connection. I think that in times of conflict, people can use the most extraordinary language. They can say the most unexpected things, even though when they're escalated, they can move to all kinds of metaphor, they can curse each other in a way, and you can say the kinds of things that are phenomenally destructive and can take a very long time to recover from if you're on the receiving end of it. And quite apart from the impact and the conflict impact of those things, it demonstrates the mechanisms of language that we have available to us, and the kinds of language and the repertoire of language that rests in our mind, of accusation, of the declaration of pain, of lament, of sadness, of fury, all of these things that rest in us, and that can be very hard to commodify. And I think poetry is particularly interested in those things. Poetry is interested in how language can pay attention to the fury that we carry, about how time can become phenomenally relative. You know, something might have happened 500 years ago, but in our family line or in our national line we carry it, and so 500 years ago isn't the past, it's the present for some people, and other people will say, oh, that's ancient history.
Okay.
So time and language do some interesting work.
They absolutely do that. That's already fascinating, but just to pick you up a little bit on what you just said, what is it you think, what is it about conflict, do you think, that triggers and generates that precision and that calling up?
I think it's an energy. And I think a moment of conflict is a time, it's almost a performance, and I don't mean that pejoratively, but it is performative. And I think for some people, the combination of pain and time and opportunity and this kairos moment of thinking I have the chance now to say what I need to say and maybe be able to say something really important, all of those things combine together to something that's artistic in us. And I think it's worthwhile looking at the performance of conflict as a piece of artistry, to look at the ways within which people reach for language and the things they say. Do they swear a lot? Do they make reference to a particular period of time? Do they land on a metaphor and keep on coming back to that metaphor because it just feels right? And all of those things are creative and really worthwhile looking at through the lens of artistry.
Yeah, and equally and oppositely then, do you think for a poet there is some attraction about conflict, or would that be a useful way to achieve that emotional register?
Well, contemporary poetry is publishing a lot of poems that are filled with rage and filled with artistry. And I don't mean rage in a way to just think, oh, they're rage poems, but they're filled with rage of justice and calling for attention toward all kinds of civic matters to do with race and gender and time and colonization and homophobia, and the ways within which all of these mechanisms have been operating and that are now being exposed. And there are so many contemporary poets where their books are filled with lots of poems that are doing in great artistry attention making on these matters, and not just young poets, older poets too. And so it's interesting how contemporary poetry publishing is reckoning there is an appetite for this now, and it's interesting to see which of those work as art. And I suppose then that draws into the question as to who's evaluating it, whether it works as art or not, and that's totally subjective. But they're all circling around something about the question of what do we do with our rage, what do we do with that profound sense of identity that feels like it's being violated. How do we arrest people into the reality that time is not the same for everybody? And I think in a situation of conflict resolution where there are measurements, what's working, what's not, how do we evaluate what's working, who decides what a fruitful looking conflict looks like and sounds like, and what it produces. I think poetry that gathers around the kind of uncontainable chaos that we carry within ourselves of I know who I am, I don't know who I am, I am enraged, and I am also surviving. I think there's a real overlap between the uncontainable parts of the human person and the uncontainable parts of the human community too, in terms of communities that carry pain and the question of poetry.
Wow. So that makes sense in terms of the craft of the poet. I'm curious about the craft of the conflict resolver, and how, for yourself personally, as somebody who has straddled both those worlds, how might you draw on the one in the other?
Yeah. Well, when I have been in situations of mediating conflict, I think partly what I try to do, like when I trained in conflict resolution, obviously lots of the time the conflict practitioner, the mediator, will receive the blunt end of people's anger at times,
Yeah.
And one time that happened to a person who was training me, and kind of as a quiet aside, he said to me, "Everything is information." And it was so helpful. I just saw that he was able to hold this, and he didn't say that back to the person. That would have enraged them more. But he said, "Everything is information." And I found that so helpful for a certain kind of critical distance to not immediately react, And then reading Wilfred Bion and his understanding of group hostility and how group hostility is communicating a dynamic that's really important. And both of those, I think, have been very helpful for me. But there's something about information that feels like it's just information. And thinking that everything is poetry has really helped me too. Because sometimes if somebody's really enraged, I would think, what would this look like on a page?
Wow.
What would this look like on a piece of theatre?
Yeah.
How would you pay attention to what this is meant to make me feel rather than what it's meant to make me analyse? And paying attention to that, to just think, fuck, I feel so angry right now, based as to the injustice when somebody's slamming back at you as the mediator, and to pay attention to that, to think, oh, I think that's the point. I think they're sharing their anger with me. Rather than being angry at me, they're sharing their anger with me.
Yeah.
And because sometimes when you see a poem where it just looks like words have exploded over the page and you're thinking, I'm totally confused, I don't know where to go, that's the work of the poem. Because the poem is meant to say, nobody knows where to go here. So there's Danez Smith, African-American poet, who's writing in their first book about living with HIV as a black queer man, black queer non-binary person in the United States. And that is the book at times where you'll open a page and it'll just have the word blood scattered across it, and you think, is this a crime scene or the detritus left from really poor mismanagement of public health policy? And you feel like, I don't know where to start. And that's the poem's work. I don't know where to start. Rather than thinking, oh, I know exactly how to read this poem. I don't even know where to start. And that, I think, can be really helpful. Seeing the experience of being a mediator and having that less information, although information is helpful, but more that underlying level of thinking the unconscious of this is communicating something to me, and I'm paying attention to the work of the poem that's being performed for me and being drawn into that register, rather than having to think, well, I know how to categorize what you're saying now as A, B, and C. We can write up the issues on the whiteboard here, and then we'll be able to choose the easiest one to work on, and blah, blah, blah. You can find a way, without it being pretending to be therapeutic, but by saying what it feels like is that you don't even know where to begin.
You're touching on theatre as well as poetry. I think you're kind of playing between the two, and you are reminding me of Erving Goffman's presentation of self in everyday life. That's a performative dimension of what's going on in conflict. That's a theme I think you've already touched on. I guess my follow-up question has to be then, that as a reading of the situation, I can see the value as a reading of the scene. I'm curious about as a response to then, in your own wording, in your own way of responding to that. Is there something of the poetic in that as well?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like in poetry, there's this big question: what is a poem? Nobody knows, really.
Yeah.
Some people will say, well, it's a classic poem. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on higher vales and hills. Other people will point to something that has the quality of poetry, even though you might not be able to say, here's the particular mechanisms of poetry. Don Patterson, Scottish poet, says a poem is a little machine for remembering itself, which I love that one.
Yeah,
and
that's
I
great.
think in all of those we're left with a mystery, not figuring out why it is that we arrange words in particular formulations that carry some bit of a self-contained machine that is concerned with its own self-preservation and music and communication and impact and performance as well. And I think the things that people land into accidentally in conflict, the things they say, I think often when people are in an escalated time, they do keep on returning to phrases like a chorus, and those seem to be spontaneous sometimes. You can feel like they latch into those as with an emotional register and a sonic register, and therefore, because it feels somehow cathartic, they come back to that and back to that and back to that. And that in a certain sense becomes like an occasional poem. It's not being written down, but it is being enacted in the moment. And there's a ritualistic element to that, and you see how ritualistic elements can be filled with catharsis, and they can also escalate, of course. You can use anything for escalating conflict, but it does show that even in moments of what we would call unguarded content, we turn to form in order to be able to elevate or escalate the unguarded content. And I think it's worthwhile recognising that. I'm not saying that poetry is a moral act in the context of conflict. The question is what are you using it for? You can use poetry to incite hatred as much as you can use poetry to incite some kind of resolution.
I'm curious about your idea of a chorus. That sometimes it's almost like you feel the chorus coming in a good song, don't you? And riding that wave, that's a really interesting metaphor, because one of the metaphors I sometimes employ when thinking about working with people in conflict would be steer in. And it's almost like rather than steer in, you're actually just riding the kind of wave, the logical wave, or the wave of the performance. Would you provide those words? Would you sometimes think that, or just intuitively think, I'm gonna here's what to say now?
Well, I suppose one of the things that can be interesting is to point out what people are saying but not paying attention to it. I do a lot of poetry editing with people, and often it depends on the person, but like they might have written a piece, and then I'll talk to them on the phone or in person and say, tell me more about this piece. What does this poem know? What's underneath it? And they'll say stuff to go, God, that needs to be in the poem. So I'll make a note of it to say, listen to what else you're saying that you're not elevating there, or listen to what you're doing but that you're not paying attention to. Because there might be something that's pretty tropish, or something that's quite inherently self-contradictory in the way a person has written a piece of art. And you want to go, you're actually doing something much more interesting when you're talking about it than what you put down as your draft.
So you're almost a mediator as editor.
Well, exactly. I mean, I have found that listening in the context when people are describing their conflicts, because you're always trying to look at the things that hold things together when you're listening to a conflict. And I found that to be very helpful as a poetry editor. And I think you can do the same thing in the context of conflict, because you're listening, hopefully, deeply, to thinking, what is it that you're circling around, and you might know it, but you might not. And everybody can benefit from somebody who was listening well and listening wisely, and to point out the course that they're doing, or to point out the form that they're doing. And some of that overlaps, of course, with a kind of a psychological listening, and some of that overlaps perfectly with classic mediation training. But I think having our minds open for the kind of form that people use, and metaphor, like Mary Lynch, who's the leader of Mediation in Northern Ireland, she and I, for the last few weeks, ran some poetry workshops for using poetry for reframing conflict, and looked over 3 different weeks at different ways of poetry using that. And we looked in one of those sessions at Yvonne Boland, an Irish poet who died just this year, and she had a poem about noticing all these famine roads that were built in Ireland in the 1840s, where in order to be given an absolute meagre payment of food, starving people were just told, build a road. And there's just these roads, straight roads, going up and down over hills, going nowhere really. And often they'd stop just going into a wood because everybody had died. You know, there were just these purposeless roads done for the purpose of somebody thinking, rather than feeding starving people who didn't need to be dying, because there wasn't a potato blight that was killing us, there was policy that was killing us, just thinking, well, no, people need to work for their soup. And so in the image, this poem has these roads that just end totally going nowhere. And Mary was saying to me that she was in a mediation, and somebody used this metaphor a few days later where they just said, it feels like I'm on a road to nowhere. And because Mary had been paying attention to the imagery of the poem, she was really struck by this. And after they'd finished, you know, what they wanted to say, Mary said, can we just go back to that road? Tell me more. And the person hadn't even realised they'd used it, because often I think people use metaphor just as a quick grab it and throw it away. They think that the concept, but what Mary did was to elevate the image and to say, tell me more about the road. And that totally opened up the conversation, because actually they had, without knowing it, landed on a metaphor that was really, really important in terms of the exhaustion, in terms of everything that was along the way, in terms of what's the point of all of this, and in terms of whose plan was it anyway to build this road, like who was the engineer that decided this, and it opened it up.
Wow. So, Pádraig, I think I need to come to a close, but one final thought really would be for those who work in conflict resolution who are not poets, can you offer, where would they start? Where might they go to get some assistance from this rich world that you are familiar with?
Where would you go? I mean, Joy Harjo's book, Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings, is really brilliant. She is currently the Poet Laureate of the United States, the first Indigenous American person to hold that post.
Okay.
And she's just, it's only a 12-month post, but you can do it twice, so she's just started the second post of that. And her book, Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings, from 2015, she takes a classic mediation spine, you know, the 5, you know, established ground rules and do this and do that and create a listening atmosphere. And she writes a poem for each one of those. And like in the established ground rules, she has this whole poem about the ground and the land. The land is a being who remembers everything, she says. You must speak in the language of justice. Remember the turtle, the deer and the crane. It's extraordinary what she does by just opening up, rather than rules, the word ground. And she literally makes you think, what piece of land are we having this on? And that is a character in the conversation we're having. And partly what the poetry does there is it just expands you up. And it isn't trying to say, and here's how you turn this into a conflict resolution technique. It actually opens up yourself to go, my God, this is so expansive. And somehow that opening up gives you a different perspective, I think.
Sure.
In one of them, she has this poem, Eliminate Negative Attitudes During Conflict. And she says, a panther crouching in a cypress tree about to pounce is a panther crouching in a cypress tree about to pounce. She kind of highlights that for some people they go into a role of just, I am here as predator. And that there can be a performance of predator and prey that happens. And what does it mean? And the prey is singing its own death song, this gazelle that's coming. And she's kind of highlighting, where have we put into place a performance where we've got these two roles, you know, the predator and the prey, and what might it be to pay attention to that and to undo it? Oh, it's brilliant. So I'd say that's a great book.
Yeah, that's a brilliant recommendation. Just the other day I was at something where someone used something from your fellow countryman Yeats about the line about slouching towards Jerusalem.
Oh yeah. And
at the beginning of our conversation just now, it struck me that sounds like somebody who was tapping into a rage in the most visceral fashion. That seemed a fair.
The older he got, yes. I've been reading through Yeats all of this year, and his earlier poetry it's filled with skill but also arrogance. And the older he got, the more he'd failed in life, and the more he lived with his own kind of addiction to being torn, because he's always writing poems about being torn. The more he applied that as a civic graft, and the more he realised that his affluence didn't mean that he would be successful in his endeavours. his national endeavours, I think his poetry became more and more useful in terms of that, in terms of thinking about how being in conflict or trying to analyse conflict, it means coming in contact with your own failure. It took him a while to get to the stage where he could contact his own failure. He's a bit of an arrogant fellow when he's younger, but he's skilled. I mean, his stuff is brilliant. But I much prefer him after the Abbey years, when he didn't write much poetry during those Abbey years, and he realised how difficult it was to run a theatre. And I think he had to reflect on his incapacity as a result of that. So, and therefore his older poetry, I think, is quite magnificent in that.
Fantastic. Pádraig, we could talk all day about this, but it's a brilliant glimpse, I think, and I think you have brought to life that sense of how the poetic might help us both read and respond to and be in other people's worlds. So, thank you.
Thanks, Charlie.